I'm Geoff Hornady. You might say accuracy is my business. I make bullets.
You are listening to the Hornady Podcast.
Thanks for joining us and enjoy the show.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Hornady Podcast. We appreciate you tuning in. I'm your host, Seth Swerzik, and I'm joined today beside me, marketeer Judd Jarzynka, and across the table, Matt Ritchie. Guys, thanks for coming on.
Pleasure is all mine again.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, we've got a guest here that is a purveyor of something that we certainly enjoy. I know you guys are all about this, and we've joked over the last couple weeks here doing these podcasts that every hunt turns into a coyote hunt when you see a coyote. And it's so true, and they're so fun, and they're so cagey, and they're so smart. So, yeah, I'm pretty excited to get this conversation going and learn what we need to learn. So join me in welcoming our guest today, Geoff Nemnich. Geoff, thanks for coming on the show with us.
Hey, great to be on here with you guys.
Yeah, Geoff, you've been shooting Hornady now for a long time, and people are probably familiar with your YouTube series, The Last Stand, and obviously your podcast, the Eastmans Predator Pros podcast. And you've been into the coyote game for a long time. And if anybody knows how to get it done, it's probably you.
You're making me feel old now, you know? I remember 15 years ago looking at all these old guys in the sport, you know, that have been doing a long time, and now, you know, here we are.
Sure. Well, before we make you feel old, let's make you feel young again and tell us about what Geoff was doing growing up. Where'd you grow up? Were you an athlete doing sports in the outdoors? What got you into the outdoors and into coyotes, and kind of how'd that get started for you?
You know, I grew up out in western Nebraska, graduated high school from Gehring. So down the road from you guys, you know, a ways, but, you know, hunting and fishing opportunities galore out here. My dad hunted and fished, so, you know, had the opportunity at a very young age to go with him. Usually it was waterfowl hunting or pheasant hunting. That's just what my dad liked to do. But, you know, was able to kill my first duck and goose and deer, you know, when I was, you know, 9, 10, 12 years old. Yeah, kind of, you know, when I turned 16, it kind of just opened the door to a lot of new things, you know, because I had the freedom to go where I wanted and do what I wanted to do. And
sure.
You know, as you guys know, Nebraska doesn't have a whole lot of public ground, you know, maybe 3% or something like that.
I think it's, 2%.
Yeah. And we have a few little public areas out here. So after I turned 16, best friend and I, you know, we said, hey, let's just load up, you know, shotguns, 22s. Let's just go out to this public hunting area and just blast stuff, you know, whatever we could find to shoot. And it must have been later winter, maybe February, March this time. Well, actually back it up. It was probably just shortly after I turned 16. So it would have been February. But anyway, we head out to this public hunting area. And as you know, our public areas usually have like a parking area, and then you got to hike in on everything. So we pull into this gravel parking lot, and I look across the gravel, and I see something laying in the rocks. So I walk over there, and it's a lanyard of hand calls. You know, and this would have been in the mid 90s. Pick it up, and it's a lanyard full of critter calls. You know, Major Boddicker had a line of calls out back in the day. And I mean, it's the little orange peewees, and it had the big howlers, and it had them all in there. So obviously somebody was out there calling coyotes, and they loaded up their truck and dropped their lanyard in the parking lot and forgot about it. So I picked this baby up and was like, oh man, you know, this is, you know, there wasn't a whole lot of literature and stuff at that time. You know, there wasn't YouTube, there wasn't the internet, there wasn't really any way to find out what this was about. But I kind of took them, I started blowing them, and figured, well, heck, you know, every time I'd been out with my dad previously, before that, you know, deer hunting, especially, or antelope hunting, we would see coyotes. And like you guys said, it was a target of opportunity at that point. You'd see it. And actually shot my first coyote when I was, I don't know, I think maybe back in the 90s, you had to be 14, I believe, before you could deer hunt. Now I know they've changed it in Nebraska, but I think it was 14. So I shot my first coyote when I was 14, just out deer hunting. You know, I jumped across the hood and had an old lever action 308 that my dad had like probably a fixed 4-power scope on it.
Yeah, the Weaver K4.
Yeah, you know, I threw that baby across the hood, and the dumb coyote ran out there and stopped about 100 yards, and I ended up hitting him in the head. Obviously, I wasn't aiming there, but you know, that was the first coyote I ever killed. But you know, through those next couple years, we'd see coyotes and stuff. So I went home, probably annoyed the crap out of my parents blowing on these hand calls, and I figured it out a little bit. And I told my dad, I said, do you think if I gave that rancher a call where we go deer hunt, do you think he'd let me come out there and try to call coyotes? And sure enough, I called him up, and he let me come out. And Very first time I ever tried it, I was laying up in the prone on the top of the highest hill I could find. I had absolutely no idea what I was doing other than I'm just going to go blow this call and see what shows up. And I had a 25-06 that I was shooting at the time, and laying there in the prone, and I'm laying right on a fence. I'm kind of laying there looking down the hill, and the fence was kind of running left to right where I was laying. Well, I'm a left-handed shooter, and I look over to my left, hard left, right down the fence, and there's a coyote standing there about 75 yards looking at me. So, as a left, it's tough, especially laying in the prone to get moved. So I'm just slowly scooting and scooting and scooting and scooting. And the whole time the coyote kind of sat there moving his head, looking at me, wondering what the hell I was doing. And he stood there long enough, and I got turned and shot him. And I thought, oh, man, this is cool. This is so easy. These coyotes are so dumb. And then it was probably... it was probably at least 2 years. I don't even know. I mean, it was a long, long time before we actually killed another coyote that we called in. I mean, we were educating coyotes left and right. That's when the whole learning process starts, and it's kind of been that way ever since.
That's pretty neat. And yeah, I think a lot of us, sharing those experiences. You turn 16, have gun, have truck, will travel.
Yeah. Yeah, I got a chuckle out of it too because I annoyed the heck out of my wife and my kids with all my hand calls, and I'd have a lanyard in my pickup, and I'd anywhere I went, if I was by myself, I was practicing howling and rabbit calls and sequences and everything. So that hits home with me. My kids still cringe when I want to watch a calling all coyotes video or get my calls out. They still cringe. So
educating the kids.
Yeah, yep, exactly. Yeah.
Yep. So when did it transition from, wow, this is fun and I'm kind of getting better at it, into something that became, more of a, how did it morph into a profession?
Well, after, like I said, during my high school years, I didn't do any winter sports. So, I had lots of time on my hands just between working and things. So we spent a lot of time hunting, and not just coyotes, we'd hunt ducks and geese and deer
Sure.
and all that kinds of stuff. After high school, I went into the Marine Corps. So I was gone for 4 years there. Didn't get a whole lot of chances to hunt. I'd come home once or twice a year, and maybe hunt a few times. But once I got out of the Marine Corps in 2002, I was going to college. So, I had all the time on my hands that you could possibly want to go hunt. And at that time I hunted a lot of different things still, waterfowl, probably 50-50 between waterfowl and, big game and coyotes. And, maybe after doing that for a few years, I really just fell in love with coyote hunting. The challenge, just everything that it entailed, the speed of the hunt. I'm not a very patient person. Most predator hunters aren't real patient people. I mean, I think that's what really draws them to predator hunting.
Fast action.
Yeah, so you're able to move a lot. You're not sitting in the same spot. You're actively pursuing, trying to find coyotes and things. And I like the shooting aspect of it. I did a lot of shooting in the Marine Corps, and things like that. So I really like the aspect of that. And, there's just a kind of a switch at one point, and I just said, you know what? You only have X amount of days of winter to hunt. And between family and work and everything else. And I said, well, if I really want to get good at coyote hunting, I need to spend, 90-95% of those days hunting coyotes and nothing else. And that's kind of what I did at that point. Instead of hunting coyotes 20 days a winter, I would hunt coyotes, 50 or 60 days a winter. And it's just,
wow.
At that point, you're just calling in that many more coyotes. You're seeing that many more coyotes. You're making that many more coyote stands, and you just get better that much faster. And you just learn things that much faster just through that much more experience that you're giving yourself.
Sure.
At a rapid rate. So, that's been that way now since probably 2005 or 6. They're about in the late 2000s, maybe 2007, I decided, you know what? I'm seeing some pretty cool stuff out here. And at the time there was a DVD market out there for coyote hunting. Like you talked about calling all coyotes, Matt. Randy Anderson had a DVD line out. Rick Paulette, who's a great buddy of mine that films The Last Stand with me now, he had the Verminator, series of coyote hunting DVDs out.
Watch
I think Les Johnson at the time had some DVDs. There was a handful of guys that were putting out coyote hunting DVDs, and I thought, you know what, I could do that. And So kind of self-taught myself with the cameras and all that kind of stuff, and the extra work that goes into filming your hunts. And, was able to put out my first DVD in 2008, got in with a company called Stony Wolf, and they kind of distributed DVDs to all the big box stores, and got in with them, and, ended up putting out a series of 3 DVDs in 2008, 2010, and 2012. And they were sold at Cabela's and Walmart and you name it. And that's kind of what got me into the commercial side of things, if you want to call it that, which kind of got me to the point where I am now with, doing the podcast and filming the Last Stand show and all that's entailed there. But throughout that process, I started a project out here, what I call Coyote Craze College. And at the time, early in the 2000s, there were lots of guys wanting to go on guided coyote hunts, but there really weren't a whole lot of outfitters out there doing it. And if they did, it was more or less you were a big game outfitter. You had the land leased up, and then you just had one of your guides just would take a guy out coyote hunting, but he really didn't have the knowledge base of coyote calling. Mm-hmm. So I started doing a few guided coyote hunts, and I realized it just wasn't the right people that I was wanting to work with. And I've always had a need or a want, I guess, or an ability to teach and explain things, I guess, a little bit better. I do a lot of coaching now with my boys. I love coaching baseball. I've always, even back before I had kids, I volunteered and coached, football teams and things like that. Originally, I was going in to be a teacher, my first actual year of college, but then I realized, the money wasn't real great, and I just decided to go the business route instead. But so I've always liked that. So I came up with this idea to put on a coyote hunting school, and I started that back in about 2010. And early on, it took a while to get it going and get the notoriety out there and things like that. But now it's a pretty popular thing I do. Classes book up within about a day of me releasing all the class dates throughout the season. But yeah, that's, I've kind of got my hands in about every possible thing you could do in the coyote world at this point, between filming and podcast and teaching coyote schools. I do a few guided hunts on the side. I work with a few local outfitters that have some stuff lined up that have clients that want to go. So I'm just, very fortunate to be able to do a lot of different things in the coyote world, and it keeps me busy, and it keeps me learning and experiencing new things, even at this point in the game.
That's awesome. Yeah, and a neat transition into, as you called it, the commercial side of things. And it's clear to see just with that story, it was a passion, because you said you went from 20 to 50 or 60 days a winter hunting these coyotes. You don't do that if you're not hyper passionate about the topic.
Committed for sure. Yeah. I would love to be able to do that.
Yeah. And that's what I tell guys. A lot of guys are like, and it really comes down to days in the field. I mean, you can't expect, if you're the type of hunter that only makes it out maybe once a month to hunt coyotes, it's going to be tough for you to probably ever get really good at it. I mean, it's just the way it is, and, I've never been the one to brag and boast and say, but I've just been fortunate enough that I get to hunt coyotes a lot, and I should be good at it. I mean, if you get to do it a lot, you should be good at it.
That's true.
And that's the kind of the way I've always looked at it. But on that same hand, I've never been afraid to share my knowledge with people. It seems like in the hunting world, especially the coyote world, it's kind of a small knit group, and it seems like everybody that's gotten really good at it has paid their dues and fought their way through it and learned through trial and error. And it's kind of like most of them say, no, I'm not, I had to work hard to learn what I learned. I'm not going to share it with you. You need to go learn it on your own.
Sure.
I've just never felt that way. It's not nothing's ever a big secret. I thought, I want people to experience what I get to experience, with the success of just watching coyotes come in and being able to kill coyotes and things like that. So that's kind of what I've based my whole commercial career around, I guess you could say, is the ability to teach coyote hunting, explain it in a way that people can understand it. Because ultimately, if you look at the coyote world, there's a ton of great coyote hunters out there that kill lots of coyotes, but being able to explain it in a way that the normal guy can understand it is not a strong suit of many of those guys.
That's true.
Yeah.
Yep. Well, and go ahead, Judd.
Well, I'm just this might be a great segue in sharing that knowledge, because that's what I want to get after here is start firing some questions off and learn for myself, which in turn helps everybody listening.
Yeah.
But
Yeah. Well, let's dig into that. I got some questions as they relate to maybe Hornady products and when he got involved with us. And I know you guys have some tactics kind of questions because, is it fun to shoot coyotes and fun to call coyotes in? Absolutely. But it's also a pretty big conservation effort because you're never going to hunt them to extinction. They will always reproduce faster than you can kill them. And, for deer and small game, turkeys, pheasants, etc. You want to be out there hunting them. So, Judd, fire off what you got for questions here because I'm curious.
Well, the first thing I got with talking about how many days in a year you hunt and then how many stands that is, not necessarily how much ground is that, but how often are you hitting the same spots, or is the key just having as many spots as you can get permission on? I mean, making that many stands, that many days, got to have a bunch of ground, I would assume. Or can you hit spots more often than once or twice?
Yeah, good question. I mean, land access is huge. Unlike, deer hunting and some other things, I think, deer hunting is the major sport. It's the major part of hunting. I think everybody is part of deer hunting at some point in their life, I guess. So a lot of guys, when they start coyote hunting, they kind of relate back to the deer hunting thing. Well, as a deer hunter, especially maybe a bow hunter, maybe you're a Midwestern or Eastern deer hunter, you may have 40 acres or something, and you have a tree stand in there, and you can go out to that spot day after day after day and deer hunt, right? And you could maybe even kill multiple deer out of that stand. And I think people kind of relate that to coyote hunting, which it's not the same. And, the land access, having enough land is really the key. I tell people this, you're going to get one crack at a coyote to kill that coyote where he's, let's say, unpressured, uneducated, however you want to call it. And if you don't get it done that first time, that coyote is tenfold smarter the next time, possibly. I don't know. I'm just guessing on a number there, So the more times you're going back after that same coyote over and over, it's just the smarter and more wary that coyote gets and the harder he gets to kill. So, you need some time in between going to hunt places. And there's a lot of stuff involved in that. Are you the only one that hunts it? Is it private? Is it public? Who else has been in there? Has nobody been in there? But really what I try to do is set up a rotation in my properties where I can maybe hunt everything once early season. And I want to back up a little bit too, because there are a lot of guys throughout the country that hunt coyotes year round. And in most states, you can hunt coyotes year round. I've always kind of had a self-regulated season. I'll start hunting them in maybe mid-October, hunt them through maybe the first part of March, and then I'm done just with what I do. I didn't really talk about that, but I started up a lawn care business back when I was in college, so it kind of pairs up really nicely for what I do. The coyote stuff, it gives me all winter to go screw around and chase coyotes. And then our coyotes are worth some money. They always have been in where we're at. Some parts of the country, they're not worth anything, so shooting them. And then now the whole thermal game has changed where guys are spending a lot more time out in the summer, out hunting them at night and stuff like that. But for me personally, it's always just been a self-regulated season. So I'm talking about from maybe October till the first part of March, how can I, rotate my properties and hunt my properties so that every time I go out there, I feel like I have a good approach, a good, fresh set of ears to call to. And by doing, maybe a hunt early on in the fall, at that time you have the young coyotes are kind of dispersing. They're probably not all quite where they're going to end up once winter gets here. And then, I'll try to maybe wait a month and a half and try to come back through about, dead of winter, December sometime and hit it again, because now coyotes have moved around a little bit. And if you were successful early on in that property and killed a coyote out of there, you gave it a month and a half. So hopefully maybe a new transient coyote, one of these young coyotes that have dispersed out, moved in there and took over that spot, and you can come in and hunt that coyote again, midwinter. And then I usually maybe try to hunt it one time late. When I refer to late, maybe like February, and now we're into that breeding season, that transition time there, where even now, if the coyotes have been pressured a little bit, they're changing gears. They're worried about sustaining the species, not themselves, and you can throw some different things at them. You can use a lot more of those coyote-based sounds and things like that, and trick some of those older coyotes then. So that's really the rotation I look at is try to hunt everything maybe a max of about 3 times a winter, and you can go through you can put a pencil to it. And what I tell people this, you can go through, if you're really trying to figure out how much ground you need, just go through and figure out how many stands are you going to make in a month of coyote hunting from October to March, okay? And Matt, let's use you for example, all right? How many stands a month would you say you're going to make probably from now through February?
So I'm
guess.
pretty. Yeah, if I had to guess, I would say 30 to 40. You know, maybe give or take 10 stands in there, depending on if I over Christmas break, if I've got some extra days, I can put in several extra stands. But yeah, probably 30, 40, maybe 50 at the most. So in that.
So yeah, let's just take 40. And that's a good number. And I go off number of stands, not number of days hunting, because everybody hunts a little bit different. When I go out hunting, it's usually for a full day. Leave in the dark, and I'm not home till the dark. But a lot of guys will only run out and maybe make a few stands in the morning. They might run out and make a few stands in the afternoon after work or whatever. So we go off number of stands. So let's do 40 stands a month. What I'll do is I'll take that times 2, and that gives me roughly 80 stands. That's what I really need at the bare minimum to kind of make that rotation work. So you can start, whether you're using Onyx or whatever apps you have, you can start dropping pins on all the places that you think, where you have stands. And then you can start adding them up and say, man, I'm only sitting with 50 stands. Well, man, I'm way short on what land access I need. So instead of maybe spending that time going out and re-hunting that place over and over, you spend that time, driving around, knocking on doors, talking to farmers and ranchers, exploring new pieces of public ground, whatever it may be, to really build your repertoire of stands up. Because not only, that is, not all those stands are going to be good for a certain wind direction on top of that, So you might have 80 stands lined up. Well, maybe only 20 of those stands are good for a south wind, and maybe 40 of those stands are good for a north or a west wind. So the more you have, the better off you're going to be. Ultimately, your goal should be, to have enough spots where you only have to hit them once a year. I mean, that's what I tell people. If you can accomplish that, you're going to have success year-round or all season long.
Diving in even deeper on that, a question that jumped out to me is, so that many stands, just to relate it where we're at in central Nebraska, a giant chunk of the ground is, cut into quarters. So 160-acre chunks. So say you have permission on a handful of those, on that 160-acre square, how many stands would you feel you could get out of there? Is it dependent on the terrain? Is it dependent on the cover? If I have a quarter of ground, is it a one-stand spot, or is there multiple stands in that chunk of ground?
Yeah, I mean, a quarter, we're talking a quarter section, so you're talking a half mile wide by a half mile long, kind of a piece of ground for people that don't understand, what that acreage is. I mean, yeah, that's good for one stand, because by the time you come in off the road, you're going to have to drive in there 100 or 200 yards. Now you're only you only have another 500 or 600 yards till you hit that property boundary. So yeah, that place is good for probably one stand. Now, if you had a whole section, a mile by a mile, now depending on where the other roads are and things like that, you could get multiple stands out of a section, just because you could maybe come in and make one stand kind of covering the main chunk of that section. But then you can work your way back to some maybe one or two of those back corners of that property. And that's the cool thing about coyote hunting is, coyotes are coming to you. So, who knows where they come from? They could be on the neighbor's property. They could be, over here on the next property. But they're coming to you onto the property that you have the permission to shoot them on. So you can turn actually, one section into even more ground, just the way that the access, as long as it's not surrounded completely by dirt roads on every side, which might be a little challenging. But
so when you talk about, you're calling coyotes, they're coming to you. When you're going into a stand, are you assuming the coyotes are here? Or are you just, here's this chunk of ground, the coyotes could be anywhere? Or are you narrowing down in your mind, I'm pretty sure they're over here?
Well, I generally speaking, I think in order to make a coyote stand, I think you have to assume that there's a coyote there. That's what motivates you to go make that stand, right? Like if you drive by a spot and it doesn't look good to you, you'll be like, oh, there's no coyote there. Let's just keep on going. We ain't going to make that. So in your mind, you're already saying, wow, that looks pretty good, whether it's whatever it may be, whether it's the cover, the amount of cover out there, the way the terrain lays. Maybe you've seen coyotes out there before, who knows what it is, but for some of those reasons, you're saying, yep, I think there's a coyote out there. Now, specifically getting in there, yeah, there are times when I'll sit down on a stand and I'll say, okay, you might have what to tell people. Every time you walk into a stand, you have 360 degrees around you, right? But I picture that as a pie or a pizza, whatever you want to call it. Well, certain slices of that pie or pizza are out of the equation because I just maybe drove my truck right to there. Okay, so that piece of the pie is gone. Maybe the piece of pie to the left and right, if they come from there, they're going to be able to see the truck. So those pieces of the pie are gone. And then maybe our wind's blowing here off to our left. Well, that chunk of the pie is gone because if they show up straight downwind, they're going to wind us before. But really what ultimately when you get to the spot where you're going to set up, which is the center of that pie, you really want at least 180 degrees of that pie left over that is untouched, meaning I haven't drove through it, I haven't walked through it, and my wind is not blowing out into that. And then once you identify that area where you think the coyotes are going to be that's untouched, then I start narrowing it down a little bit. Okay, we're out there. Where is the coyote going to be if they're in here? And a lot of that has to do with, is it early in the day, early morning, late in the day, when the coyotes are up on the move. A lot of times they'll spend time in those, what I call transition areas, those field edges and things like that. Or is it the middle part of the day when the coyotes are laid up like, deer? They're going to bed up just like deer and cover. So, it really depends on exactly there. But, and that really comes down to, it doesn't really matter where they're at as long as they're somewhere in that 180-degree piece of the pie, then you can start getting into the details of how I set up and how I place the e-call and do all that to maximize your efficiency of actually killing those coyotes, once they show up.
Yeah, the other thing I'd like to add that too, when I, not that I'm on your level, Geoff, but when I look at a piece of ground, I spend a lot of time on the back of a horse, gathering cattle. Cattle follow, or they're like water. They're the path of least resistance. And I would say coyotes are the same way too. Like they're gonna, if you see a rutted out cow trail, following a fence line or coming down on the side of a ridge, they're going to follow that. They're going to take the path of least resistance. So that's another thing I look for when I'm making my set. So.
Yep. Now, ultimately too, a lot of people just they're like, what do I even look for? And I tell them this, if wherever you're going to sit your butt down and make a stand, draw a circle out there about 500 to 600 yards. And the more cover and terrain and cuts and everything that you can throw within that 500-600 yard circle, the better of a coyote stand it's going to be. If you can see as far as the eye can see for 700 yards and there's no cuts, there's no nothing, there's no brush, to me that's not a great coyote stand. Yeah, you might call one in and it might come from a long, long ways, but you get into a spot where there's 2 or 3 little draws, cedar draws, or you got a creek bottom down in front of you, you got some ag of some kind over here, maybe a CRP field, and that's all within that 600-yard radius of that 180 degrees we talked about. That just makes it that much better of a coyote stand because there's that much better of a chance there's a coyote going to be in there, within that 600 or 800 yards, which is the distance that most of the coyotes are coming to the call anyway.
So building on that, the question I have, and Seth, you're going to like this because we can't go a podcast without bringing up the Nebraska sandhills.
Hey, that's my jam.
My experience from hunting in the sandhills, from where we're at, cornfield, central Nebraska, the sandhills, especially if you look at them on a map, to me, everything looks similar. Everything looks kind of the same. Yep. So in the sandhills, what are you looking for? I mean, I know you kind of said the cuts and whatnot, but how do you approach, okay, I've got this piece of property in the sandhills, mostly kind of rolling hills. Yep. There's some ponds. There's some maybe shelter belts. How are you approaching that to set up some stands?
Well, I've hunted all over the country. I mean, maybe 15, 16 different states. The sandhills are still my favorite place to call coyotes, so I'm glad you guys brought this up. It took me quite a few years to kind of figure out the best way to hunt them, and I still kind of change and evolve my process of hunting it a little bit. But, generally speaking in that country, if you've never been to the sandhill country, you'll have these low bottoms, and there's lots of water in the sandhills. The Ogallala Aquifer sits underneath that whole piece of country, and, so the water table's not very deep. And so you'll get these meadows, hay meadows that have maybe little lakes and rush beds and tall weeds, and then the ranchers will come in there and mow it and hay it, and then it transitions up into these rougher sandhills. And some sandhills are just big, gradual, big sloping ones, especially once you get in the eastern part of the sandhills, probably north of where you guys are at. Mm-hmm. If you're in the west side of the sandhills, you get a lot more shorter, real choppy sandhills, more yuccas. a little more vegetation, it seems like. But usually what you'll get, especially into the winter months, are several things. A, the ranchers bring all their cattle down usually onto those hay meadows. And, they're constantly feeding those cows and things like that. So that naturally draws coyotes down in there just because the coyotes are eating the cake. The rancher brings his tractor along and is stringing out a thing of hay. I think that draws in rodents and things, and the coyotes come in there and eat that. And then obviously you might have an occasional dead cow and things like that. So the coyotes will kind of congregate around the cattle. So I'll spend a lot of time hunting those meadow areas, later in the winter. Now, early in the fall like this, the coyotes are still dispersed, clear out, kind of in what I call their summer range, maybe wherever the coyotes had their litters and things like that. So they really could be anywhere at this point, it's, and sometimes it's just a matter of blanketing the area, as best you can. The cool part about the sandhills I've always liked is just the ability to off-road and kind of get to where you want to go, In some places you hunt, you're limited to the roads. You can't leave the 2-track because of the rocks and the sagebrush and the creek bottoms and things like that. The sandhills, if you've watched any of our last stand videos and stuff like that, we just kind of pick our way through there, and I can kind of maneuver and get my vehicle and get to where I want to go, regardless if there's a little 2-track or not. And, that helps open up the opportunities there, because then what I can do is get the wind right, meaning kind of get to the downwind spot of where I want to hunt through. And then I can just make a series of stands, kind of leapfrogging my way through there, blanketing the area, because you're right, it does look the same. And there could be a coyote here, there could be a coyote there. I don't really know. There's nothing specific enough to tell me that coyote's going to be in one of those 2 spots, so I just have to call them both and hope that, and who knows, there might be a coyote in both, there might not be a coyote in either, but that's really the most effective way, is kind of blanket that area with stands. But then you'll run into specific spots where you might find a shelter belt. Maybe it's the middle part of the day and the wind's blowing. I'm like, okay, we're going to stop and specifically sneak down in there and call that shelter belt, because there could be a coyote laid up in that shelter belt. We might specifically get down on some of those hay meadows where the rush beds, once the lakes freeze over, those coyotes will get down into those rush beds and into those tall weeds and lay up for the day. We may specifically get down in there and call those. But a lot of times when you get up to those rolling choppy hills, it's just a matter of blanketing those areas in an effective way to call them in.
Well, that's awesome.
Are you still applying the same thought process to it, like Judd was talking about that section of ground? Are you still giving it that half-mile buffer between stands, or are you only going 500 yards? Or are you going further in the sandhill specifically?
Yeah, I mean, I'm probably a half mile is probably the shortest distance I'll ever go, even in a big wind. I mean, even if you're calling in maybe a 15, 20, even a 30-mile-an-hour wind, I feel like the sound's still going out there that 500-600 yard mark. I mean, coyotes have exceptional hearing, 4 times better than you and I. And, now, running like, let's say, the Lucky Duck Super Revolt or the Revolt, I mean, crazy volume in these calls. And, it cuts out there. And it goes, in my opinion, it goes out there as far as a coyote's going to want to respond to the call, especially in the middle part of the day when it's windy. The coyotes, I feel, have this imaginary bubble around them that just gets bigger or smaller throughout the day, throughout the different time of year, whatever. And, as it gets windier, as the coyotes laid up, that bubble kind of contracts, meaning the coyotes just, regardless of whether they hear it or not, they just don't want to come very far, so you got to get in close to them. So, yeah, a lot of times in those middle part of the days, if I'm getting in some of those choppier hills where those coyotes will lay up on the backside of hills in the sun, out of the wind, kind of whatever, I may go a half mile, but maybe earlier in the day when the wind's not so much, and I know that sound's really now carrying out there, 1,000, 1,200, maybe even a mile or more, and the coyotes could be responding from that far. Well, now I'll open up my stand distance a little bit. Now I may be going maybe upwards of a mile or so, if you're in those areas where you can do that, where you can just drive and stop and make a stand and keep on going, working your way through an area.
So what factors play into volume? What are you considering when you're kind of making a call of, am I going to call maxed out super loud, or am I quiet? What factors play into, I guess, just the volume of your call?
I think probably the cover, where you're at. I talked about when you sit down, you're going to probably have an idea of where you think the coyotes are going to be if they're in there, I mean, if you look off to the right and you can see for 500 yards and then there's cover and hills or brush or something that far away, okay, like that, if the coyote's in here, he's probably clear over there. But if you got a creek bottom or a canyon or whatever kind of terrain right in front of you, 100 or 200 yards, there's the potential that the coyote could be right in there too, right? I think a lot of guys, though, when it comes to volume, they give coyotes this like almost like a thought process that coyotes think like you and I, like, well, that's too loud. You're going to spook coyotes out. I err on the side of too much volume. I think a lot of guys err on the side of not enough volume because they're afraid they're going to spook coyotes. I've never been that way. I feel like I kind of have this little saying that, nothing's ever 100% in coyote hunting. Like, even coyotes circling downwind is not 100%. I've seen coyotes circle upwind for some stupid reason, so it's not ever 100%. But I tell people this, the only thing that is a 100% in coyote hunting is if they don't hear it, they will not come. So that's, for me, I err on the side of, I want to make sure that coyote, if the coyote is out there, he heard my sound. If he came, he came. If he doesn't, so be it. They don't all come just because they hear it. But I want to make sure my volume gets to where I want to go. So I max the call a ton. I mean, if I have any amount of wind, probably more than a 5 or 8 mile an hour wind, I'm usually maxing the call out. And the cool part about the Lucky Duck call is your ability to rotate the call so you can really scatter the sound in that whole 180 we're talking about, right? I want to cover sound in every square inch of that 180-degree piece of the pie. And being able to scan that call and spin that call allows you to do that. And I'll max it up, send the sound there, and see what happens.
Is that constant sound? I mean, you're switching sounds, different sounds, but are you ever, I'm going to play for 60 seconds, sit for 5 minutes, or is it just constant sound and then moving on to the next one?
I run the call continuous. I think, there are guys that do pause it, and I think their theory is, well, I talk to them about that. I'll ask them, I say, what's your theory for doing that? Well, that's just the way I was told to do it, Well, that rates that you start looking back at the history of coyote hunting. Well, before e-calls, guess what? All there was hand calls, right? Well, there's no possible way to blow a hand call for 5 minutes straight. I mean, you had to pause and you had to stop and you had to catch your breath. To me, that didn't mean that that's the best way to do it. That's just the way you had to do it, So for me, I want to throw sound out there as fast as I can. For me, it's about speed and efficiency. And if I'm sitting there quiet, to me, I'm wasting time. And I've seen coyotes where for whatever reason, maybe I bumped the call, maybe I turned it off, maybe I was getting ready to leave and a coyote showed up, and the coyotes almost check up like they hear it coming. And I don't know. For me, I think coyotes have a very short attention span. And if you kill the call for a certain amount of time, I think there's the possibility that coyote could get distracted with something else, jumping a rabbit or whatever it may be. So, yeah, I've always been a big believer in just running the call continuous. Don't put human thought into the coyote. I mean, yeah, can a rabbit sit there and scream for 4 or 5 minutes straight? Probably not. But a coyote doesn't think like you and I do. So yeah, I'm going to crank the call. I'm going to leave it running continuous until I decide to switch up the sound, and then I'm going to switch the sound and go and speed and efficiency. That's what I kind of base a lot of the stuff I do on.
Man, you're preaching to the choir here, because I think I overthink things pretty often. So yeah, putting the human thought into it, maybe take that out. So like even switching sounds, I mean, are you switching sounds constantly? Is there any, I don't know, negative thought to switching from one sound to another? You got a rabbit, you got a bird, maybe a coyote sound, or is it just play them all?
Well, I base a lot of my time on stand. How long I'm playing a sound for, I base it off a simple math equation, and it's this. Coyotes can run, top speed of a coyote's like 43 miles an hour, okay? So I picture a coyote running hard to the call. Yeah, he may be going 30, 35 mile an hour. If he's just diddy bopping, just taking his sweet-ass time, maybe like a 5 mile an hour walk, So most coyotes are somewhere in between there, right? So for simple math purposes, I say, what if we have a coyote coming at 10 miles an hour, which is on the slower end, right? A lot of coyotes are going to come in faster than that. If a coyote's trotting at 10 miles an hour coming to the call, how long does it take that coyote to cover 1 mile? Oh, look, the wheels are turning, the math.
60 seconds?
Yeah.
6 minutes.
6 minutes?
It's 6 minutes. Now, most coyotes don't come from a mile. That's a long ways for a coyote to come. Most of the coyotes that you're calling in are coming from a half mile or shorter. So it's only taken that coyote 3 minutes to cover a half mile. Now, that's if you played a sound that coyote liked, and here he comes, right? Roughly within 3 minutes. Now, this isn't every coyote. I mean, this isn't 100% deal, but this is probabilities. This is percentages, right? That's what I work off of. So a majority of the time, those coyotes within 3 minutes, if they're coming to the call, you're going to see them, shoot them, miss them, screw it up by then, whatever it is. But 3 minutes, right? So a lot of times playing the same sound longer than that 3 or 4 minutes, to me, that's wasting time. So when I'm switching up sounds, I'm doing it every 3 to 4 minutes. And, we'll get into a little bit on, what I do when I switch them. But yeah, that's what I base everything. So if I say, okay, I'm going to sit here, 9 or 10 minutes, my 9 or 10 minutes on stand can be completely different than somebody else's 9 minutes on stand or 10 minutes on stand that's maybe plays the call for a minute or two and then sits there quiet for 2 or 3 minutes and then play. In my opinion, they only blew the call for 4 minutes out of 10, and they only maybe played one different sound throughout that whole time. Where in my 10 minutes on stand, I played 3 different sounds at that 3 to 4 minute mark, touched on some different triggers, of reasons why coyotes come, whether it's playing like a prey distress sound like you guys talked about, a rabbit or a bird, or did I go to more some coyote-based sounds like pup distresses and coyote fights and things that just trigger different responses in coyotes. But really, when I sit down on that stand, I want to try to cover as much of the spectrum as I can, from prey distress sounds to coyote-based sounds, from starting off kind of less aggressive, finishing the stand as the most aggressive I can, to really just appeal to every possible potential coyote that's out there. And then at the end of 10 or 12 minutes, if nothing shows up, guess what? I'm on to the next one. And, for whatever reason, either there wasn't a coyote there or the coyote was there, just didn't want to show up, and it's not the coyote I'm after. So, on to the next spot.
Man,
that's good strategy. I have a question on the call location. You're using e-calls primarily. Where are you placing that call in relation to where you set up at?
Yeah, I've used e-calls early on when I told you when I kind of made the transition. Some of the earlier e-calls I had were all cassette-based, tapes. I think it was a Western Rivers was the first one I ever had, and, it was a huge call. I mean, it had this big speaker, it had this big cassette deck that had a built-in rechargeable battery, and then I had an old duck decoy blind bag, and I had all these cassette tapes, stuffed in the outside pockets, right? So, some of these, maybe the newer listeners to coyote hunting, maybe younger kids, it was wild because I would have to pop the cassette in and you'd hit the end of the damn tape and, there could be a coyote coming or whatever, and I'd have to eject the cassette, flip it over, pop it back in, and it would keep going. And if I wanted to switch sounds, I had to eject the cassette. I had to fumble through the pocket. I had to find what sound I wanted to switch, pop the new cassette in, so e-calls have come a long ways. And, at that time there wasn't remotes for them, which is a huge part for me of an e-call. Like you said, how do you place it? How am I able to utilize that technology, getting that e-call out away from me? Because now, back in the day, old school coyote calling, you're blowing a hand call. Well, guess what? The sound's coming right from you. And that's really what the coyote's keyed in on. He's worries about the sound and nothing else. But if you and your movement and your scent is all coming from the sound source, well, then now we start having issues because that's really what the coyote's hunting. Now, with the ability of an e-call, I can get that sound out away from me. Coyote's still hunting the sound. He's not hunting me. And now I can almost sit on the sidelines and I can even position myself in maybe what might be a better shooting position. It's not the best spot that I want the sound coming from, but it's the best spot for me to sit, to have the best vantage point, the best shooting lanes, whatever it may be. And I can take and put that sound source wherever I want and run that off a remote, So, every setup's a little bit different, as far as how far do I put the call away. I mean, a lot of times I would say roughly between, 20, 30 yards is usually the closest I'll put it. And that's usually if we got somebody running a shotgun. Obviously if you got the call too far away from the shotgunner, he's there to kill those coyotes that come running right up to the call, that don't stop. But if we don't have a shotgunner on stand and it's a little bit more openness to the stand, I have no problem walking that call out there 60, 80, 100 yards sometimes just to help mold the stand a little bit better, to help funnel coyotes into shooting lanes a little bit better, and just keep the focus away from us. We've made coyote stands with 8 of us on stand before. Wow. Filming, with camera guy, 2 cameras and 5 or 6 of us sitting there on stand in eastern Colorado. If you've ever been to eastern Colorado, the grass is about 2 inches tall. I mean, there's a few yuccas, and we were killing coyotes right at the call. And it all had to do with getting the call, getting the sound source out away from us. And as long as you're not moving, as long as you're sitting there tight, the coyotes aren't going to look over there. They're focused on that sound, and until you give them some reason to look over there at you.
Sure.
So that in an ideal scenario, then what's the wind doing where you set the call? Do you want the wind in your face? So assuming the coyote's here, do you want the wind directly in your face? Do you want it quartered a little bit? And then how do you place the call related to where the coyote is and which way the wind's blowing?
Well, we can revert back to that 180 we've been talking about, right? So when I'm the center of that, kind of where the radius of that 180 starts, I want the wind in any direction in my from right to left to right, and any degree in my face, if that makes sense. You can't always mold. Sometimes you can dictate where you set up, and maybe your access into a property will allow you to maybe call it from a crosswind setup. Sometimes your access, maybe it's going to be a headwind. It's going to be straight into your face. All are good and all will work. If I can mold it though, I prefer a crosswind setup, just because I can see the downwind at that point. If the wind's blowing from right to left or left to right, I can see that way. If it's blowing right in my face, more than likely I have some sort of cover, whether I'm sitting on a little side hill, maybe I'm sitting on a fence line. Back behind me where the wind's blowing is probably where I have the truck parked. I can't see that. So if a coyote does decide to circle and get downwind, I'm going to lose visibility after he crosses out of that 180 and kind of heads onto the back 180 of that pie or circle to try to get the wind, if that makes sense. So either is good. And, when it comes to placing the call on a crosswind setup, more times than not, I'll usually probably put it on the upwind half of that stand. Okay, so if you take that, we all refer back to that 180 again. If it's a crosswind setup, you have an upwind half, 90 degrees of that pie, and you have the downwind half, right? Whether it's the left half or right half, depending on which way the wind's coming. I may take that call and put it on the upwind half. Kind of if you draw a center line in that 180 to cut that 180 in half, that's your center of the stand. I'll maybe walk that call out 20, 30, 40 yards, but then maybe move it on the upwind half, maybe another 10 or 20 yards, just to help offset that a little bit. So any coyotes that do circle downwind, I have a little bit more of a buffer to get those coyotes killed.
Yeah, that buffer's pivotal because you've got that 70-foot buffer. They could come in and be 35 yards from you, but you're still downwind to them. So you've got a 35-yard shot on a coyote that's looking at that call. So yeah, that's I've had that happen, and it's just cool. Like, it just works. Like
That's got to feel like you set the stage.
Yeah, they read the script, and it played out right in front of your eyes, and you got a slam dunk shot on a coyote. So
yeah, and that's what, also a lot of times you'll utilize a downwind guy too. If it's you and a buddy, or if you got multiple guys hunting, I tell people you don't need all three of you sitting ass cheek to ass cheek, pointing it right at the call. Utilize your manpower a little bit. One guy, if it's beneficial, if you think, hey, if I send you 100 or 200 yards downwind, maybe on that downwind half of the stand, there's some pretty good cover there, some pretty good, terrain, or you think, hey, there's a pretty good chance a coyote could even come from there. Hey, you might send somebody downwind because he'll have a closer, quicker shot at that coyote that does show up down there, as opposed to waiting for that coyote to hopefully stay out away off your wind and get all the way up to the call.
Wow. Well, speaking of shooting coyotes, if you would, just a slight change of gears, walk us through what you're shooting coyotes with. What's your cartridge selection, your rifle selection? You running a suppressor, optic? How big of a scope are you running? What are you running for thermal? Walk us through what you're shooting stuff with.
So I'm a big AR guy.
Yeah.
When the AR ban was lifted in 2004, that's when I bought my first AR. And just having a military background, I saw the advantage of shooting that, early on. With the quick follow up shots. When it comes to shooting running coyotes. And then the 223 round is a pretty effective round for shooting coyotes with.
Simple as that. 223 and an AR-15 can't go wrong. Are you shooting suppressed?
Yeah. So like I said, I've shot nothing but an AR-15 since 2004. The only bolt gun I own is just a big, like 300 Win Mag for occasional deer or whatever. But, I got my first suppressor in 2009, maybe 2008. Kind of early on, I just saw the writing on the wall there and thought, man, that's something I need to be part of.
Yeah.
Not necessarily for the coyote hunting aspect of it. Originally, I thought that's what I wanted it for, but anybody that's ever shot suppressed, it's like, wow, I don't know why I didn't do this 100 years ago. Just the way it's just so awesome. I was the first one out of my whole circle of buddies. We all have these circle of hunting buddies, right? And I was the first one, and everybody's like, oh God, why are you spending money on that? And him hawing around. And back then, the wait was like 3 months. to get them. And,
Ugh.
now every single one of my buddies that I hunt coyotes with has them, kind of deal.
Oh yeah.
My boys are kind of suppressor snobs. They've shot suppressors since they were old enough to hold a gun. So anytime we go hunting with somebody, that's like the first thing they ask, do they have a suppressor?
That's a good question.
It is, yeah.
Yeah.
definitely.
It
It's
changes
like,
the
I got to start
experience.
weeding them out. If you don't have a suppressor, you can't come hunting with us.
Yeah. That's awesome. Optic wise, do you find it beneficial on those ARs to run, big magnification, or are you a low power kind of guy, or were you running for optics?
I've always been a big magnification guy. I shot loopholes for a lot of years. That was just kind of a personal choice, just kind of what I had. They were always kind of right in my price range, of what I could afford. And then once I started getting into the commercial side of things, I pursued Loophole quite, pretty hard to try to get them as a sponsor of what we do for the show and everything like that. Well, they just, for whatever reasons, they just weren't interested. Well, last year Sig Sauer Optics came along, and they're a big part of what Eastmans does.
Okay.
And so they were wanting to sponsor the podcast. So I said, you know what, I've always used Loophole, but to be honest with you, I haven't ever looked into a lot of other stuff. I didn't really know what was out there. I was kind of narrow-minded, I guess, on what I was using. So I said, send me what you got, and started doing some research on this BDX system, because I had always shot dials. Even on my Loophole, I had a custom dial for my 223. That was
Sure.
a great, with, I think the CDS system is what they called that. So, 400 or 500 yard, I'd spin it to the 4, and it was usually really dead on, as far as holding for the wind and stuff.
Right.
But, the BDX system, I've always been about technology, with whether it's using nothing but e-calls and suppressors and AR-15s. It's just kind of what's always drawn me to that side, was the technology side. So I thought, this BDX stuff is kind of right up my alley. So I started doing some research, got a hold of, a set of the rangefinder binos, a Sierra 6 BDX scope, and started messing with the app and got it all tuned in. And I really like it, the speed of it, how fast you can, get on target. But yeah, I shoot a lot of magnification. I shoot a 5-30 by 56. I keep my scope on 10. I keep my scope on 10, 11 power all the time. I don't ever run it lower than that. Whether it's running coyotes at the call, running coyote, whatever it is. I'll zoom it in a lot when I'm shooting farther coyotes at 200 or 300, 400 yards. But
Sure.
But that's a product of me shooting a lot. I wouldn't recommend somebody running out there and buying that scope. Probably if you're new to coyote hunting, you probably want something on the lower end. That's kind of the given thought, is that you want to kind of keep your scope kind of turned down low, so that when the coyotes do come running in close, you can find them in the scope and
Target
you're not battling
acquisition.
that, trying to find them in there. But yeah, on top of that, I've usually run offset 45, a red dot
That's what I was going to ask.
on
Yep.
an offset 45 mount. And
Yeah, that's probably pretty clutch.
I think I'm running that. Yeah, I think right now I'm running that Sig Sauer Romeo 3 XL. I think it's got a 6 MOA dot in it. I like the little bit bigger dot, for that close stuff. Just your eye picks it up a little bit quicker, I think, when, and that's made for shooting these coyotes at 20, 30 yards that, if you don't have a shotgun, if you're not real comfortable trying to get a coyote in a scope running that close, you can just roll that gun over a little bit, and it's just like, shooting a bead on a shotgun kind of, to some extent, and just, you can get those running coyotes killed a little quicker and easier with that offset red dot.
That's a good point, I guess. Yeah, especially running an AR when you have that capability to offset something like that. Makes a lot of sense because, if they come in right on the call, you're equipped. What bullet are you running in that 223?
Ever since Hornady came out with those 53 grain VMAX in the Superformance load, it's just been, I don't know, it's the best coyote hunting bullet I've ever shot. Like I said, I've been shooting ARs now for a lot of years. I've been around 2250s and you name it. I've been around buddies of mine that shoot all that kind of stuff. And for whatever reason, as a matter of, yesterday we went into depth on my podcast with, about, the development of that 53 and why it is such a better bullet, at least in my opinion, out of the AR-15. But, just the external ballistics on it are great. My gun shoots it phenomenally. Just a factory rifle shooting factory ammo, I'm sub half-inch groups at 100 yards, which
Perfect.
is kind of unheard of, honestly. A lot of people guarantee 1-inch groups at 100, but not sub half-inch groups, And so it gives me that. So now I'm just extremely confident in the gun itself. Like, okay, this is going to drive tax. If it's up to me now. And then the terminal ballistics of that bullet when it comes to shooting coyotes is just, from a first standpoint, you can shoot a coyote broadside at 100 yards, and you'll walk up to the coyote. It'll drop the coyote dead before it hits the ground, and you'll walk up to that coyote, and there won't be a drop of blood on the coyote. And you're like, wow, this is pretty cool. I mean, there's no exit, no entry. I mean, just a small entry, whatever. Running coyote. I shoot a lot of running coyotes, so obviously shooting running coyotes, you're not always precise when you're just almost trying to just hit them.
Sure.
So you're not always hitting them in the perfect spot, but hitting coyotes in the back half with that bullet, very, very few get away. I mean, the wound channel it creates, whether you gut shoot them, whether you shoot them through the hips, most of those coyotes are dead before, I have a chance to kind of square up and shoot them again as they're flopping around on the ground. So, just a tremendous, tremendous bullet.
So talking about those running coyotes, I know Matt's mentioned this to you a bunch of, and just watching the Last Stand videos, you're pretty dang good at hitting those running coyotes. Yeah. So what, how, what's your mindset? What are you doing? What are you thinking?
Well, spray and pray, right? No, I'm just
accuracy through volume. Yeah. Are you a machine gunner by chance?
No, I was actually a mortarman, but, so, running shots is one of those things that it's super hard to teach. I've just done it a lot. We talked about hunting the sandhills, right? And you're off-roading. Well, in Nebraska, you can shoot out of a vehicle as long as the vehicle's not moving and as long as you're not on a public roadway. So, when you're hunting that sandhill country and you're bouncing from stand to stand, you're going to bump coyotes. It's just the way it is. We call them road dogs or whatever you want to call them.
Yep.
And so over the the course of 20 years, throwing the gun out the window and shooting at running coyotes, you get lots of practice. And and then what I do now on the commercial side of things with schools and things like that, if I got a bunch of new coyote hunters with me on stand, we call in a lot of coyotes that get missed standing there at 100 or 200 yards, and I always take my rifle just to back everybody up, so I get lots of practice there. Trying to clean up everybody else's messes, I guess, if you could say it, that way. But so yeah, it's hard to teach it. I think to me it's all instinctual. Like if I shot a running coyote, I couldn't instantly after I shot that coyote, I probably couldn't tell you how far I led that coyote. It's just one of those things that shooting a lot of them, just kind of seeing the angles. A lot of it's three-dimensional. The thing with running coyotes is it's like three-dimensional shooting almost. It's not always. They might be running left to right broadside. They're quartering to maybe some extent. They might be going straight away, but a lot of times they're going up or down a hill. So not only are you leading them out in front, you're having to compensate your bullet drop at that distance, and then also you're having to compensate high or low for the angle that they're running. So it's just a weird deal and something that's hard to teach other than just going. I wish there was. You guys, Hornady need to design some sort of target system.
Yeah.
Sling some 8-inch targets across the pasture at 30 miles an hour, somehow,
Yeah. Well, and yeah, you said it. There's really no way to teach that. It's such an instinctual thing. And, you see that a lot with shotgunning where you find a shotgun that fits you really well and you don't have to aim it. You can look at what you want to shoot and then you shoot it. And it just drives the point home that the human eye and the human brain is such an amazing organ that it can process range, bullet drop, and angle all at the same time. And you can get a shot off and hit what you're aiming at, which is pretty remarkable. And you do it in a split second and you don't even think about it. There's no conscious thought involved. And in fact, the more conscious thought you give it, the worse shot you probably end up making.
Yeah.
Oh, a big part of that to me too is two things, and I want to touch on for guys is I've never shot anything but an AR-15, a 223 for the last almost 20 years. Okay. So I've trained my brain to shoot a 3,000 foot per second rifle. Okay. I don't bounce back and forth. I don't go out hunting one day with my AR-15 and then the next time I go coyote hunting, I'm not taking out my 22-250 pushing 3,800 feet per second because now everything's different. All my leads that I have now ingrained in my head shooting a 3,000 foot per second rifle are going to be way off if I'm shooting a 3,800 feet per second rifle, right? So I've preached this, take one rifle and shoot it all the time and get really, really good at it. If you want to get good at shooting running coyotes, because that's really what it is. It's instinctual in your mind. And if you're bouncing back and forth, your brain's just scrambled. You have no clue where to hold, because obviously the hold on a 200-yard broadside running coyote's going to be a little different with a 22-250 than it is a 223. So pick one rifle, shoot a lot. And then another thing is with your magnification on your scope. Like you told you, I keep my scope at about 10 power, 10, 11 right in there all the time. And I'm always shooting at running coyotes on 10, 11 power. It's not one time I'm shooting coyotes on 4 power, running coyotes, and the next time I'm shooting them out on 11. It's always at 10. So what that does is that trains your eye at certain distances. On 10 power, that coyote is X amount so big in the scope. And if he's bigger in the scope, then that tells me that coyote's closer. If he's smaller, then that tells me he's farther away, and it kind of helps, train your brain on where that lead needs to be by keeping your scope at the same power all the time when it comes to shooting coyotes.
On the shooting the same load thing, I'm going to take this clip back and play it for my buddies. So to drive that point home even more, waterfowl. I got into waterfowl, I don't know, a chunk of years ago now, and I've shot the same load from when I started to now. Teal season, a couple seasons ago, teal are fast. I'm going to switch up, and I went with a higher velocity shot. I could not hit a single thing, to the point where my buddies were making fun of me. And I attributed it to my leads were different because I was shooting a higher velocity load.
Yeah, you're probably shooting in front of everything, I bet, weren't you?
Exactly. I couldn't hit a stinking thing, and I switched back to my load, and I'm still not a great shot, but I'm doing better than I was. So that drives that point home even more.
Well, luckily,
it's just what I was used to.
You're a good cook, and you can sling that duck line breakfast.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, you're looking at shotguns. What? I mean, some of those loads are like 1550, and you can buy some other stuff that's 1200 or something. So just the difference in 300 feet per second when you're talking a 30-yard shot, at a flying duck.
I think some of that teal shot that I was shooting was like 1600 almost, and then my go-to load is like 1350, 400. Yeah. So it was. I was not hitting anything. So you mentioned here, about the truck dogs or the road dogs, and then when you were talking about driving through the sandhills, and this has happened to me too. I'm sure it's happened to a lot of guys. You bump that coyote with a pickup. Is that coyote done? Do you have a chance at that coyote anymore, or what's your thought process there?
I think instantly then I usually make a decision. If he's close enough, I think I got a pretty high percentage of killing that coyote, I'll usually shoot him. Kind of like I'm going to take the close to the guarantee right here, and get that coyote killed. If he's 400 or 500 yards out there and kind of running, the odds of hitting that one aren't very good. So I'll take my chance of that. Hey, we might call that coyote back in. Or another thing too, you have to think about too is I'm going to blast away right here. Maybe I'm getting ready to go right over here and make a stand. Do I really want to fire off 3 or 4 or 5 shots, even suppressed, and kind of maybe booger up the area a little bit just with these shots? Because I think if there's a coyote in there and he hears all this ruckus or something going on over here, and then 5-10 minutes later a wounded rabbit starts crying from that same spot, it could be enough to where that coyote says, nah, I'm good. I don't know if I want to go and inspect that area. But my experience is most of the time they don't come back. Like whether you bump them and don't shoot at them, they're probably gone sometimes. But I'll make mental notes sometimes and say, okay, maybe we'll come back in here in a little bit, maybe a couple hours, maybe we'll loop back around and come back into this area, and hit that after we give him some time to kind of settle down and settle back into what he's doing. I'll do that, but very rarely do they ever come back.
Yeah, well, that's super interesting. I mean, I should have probably said this from the start, but it's probably pretty apparent from your guys' level of calling and experience. I'm super interested, have done it a handful of times, and want to do more and get better. So that's kind of been my perspective throughout. So hearing all this stuff is like drinking from a fire hose. I can't wait to get out and put some of this to work.
And it's that time of year now, and I'm even more behind the curve, just being targets of opportunity. I need to get out there and get the e-call working and start making some stands. And not to say that I couldn't have laid down a bunch of coyotes. I just got done hunting the sandhills, and my gosh, it was pandemonium out there.
They're thick this year too. The coyotes are. I mean, the numbers wise, at least for my area, they're thick. You start seeing them on the gravel roads, and they're just running around. Like you're like, oh yeah, there's good numbers. So,
there's
no mange, plenty of feed for them, rabbits and mice and all that. And
it's kind of crazy how the world works here. But I just listened in yesterday on the podcast you guys did with Geoff, talking coyotes on his podcast. And then getting home last night, I'm out in the country, coyote ripping off right behind the shelter belt. Like close enough to where it was over here. Then I walked in the shop and it was on the other side. So just on the other side of the shelter belt. Craziest thing after that, a guy that I messaged last year to ask for permission about calling coyotes, he had some cattle in there and didn't want to shoot in there last year. He messaged me last night, said, "Hey, can you come shoot some coyotes? They're bad this year."
Yeah. Oh.
Driving to work this morning, I see a coyote off the road. So it's like, it's meant to be. I need to get out there.
It's time, fellas. It is. It's time. Yeah, the hides are good, and they're probably thick as they're going to be, and it's time to start laying them down.
Yeah, even with a little bit of flurries today, like it tried it this morning. It's like, oh yeah, it's get through this next weekend, get deer season done, and then it's coyote season.
Yeah,
Time to start.
Well, we've been talking coyotes now for a little over an hour. Is there some last questions you want to get out of this guy? Because we're going to have to make this a part 2 if we make it a whole lot longer.
I'm going through my notes here, so I should have brought a pen and paper. I've been taking notes on my phone as we go through. And I've only got one more thing. You mentioned earlier when we were talking about how you switched sounds.
Yeah.
I've heard guys that just switch direct, no issue. I've heard guys that are playing, say, a rabbit sound, and they turn the volume way down, switch to a different sound, turn the volume back up. I've heard a bunch of different things. So what's your process for actually switching between different sounds?
Well, normally is I'll volume it down just a little bit. If let's say I'm playing the call on 32, playing the rabbit, and I look down at my remote and I'm like that maybe 3 to 4 minute mark, and I'm like, okay, it's time to switch up something different. I'll volume it down to maybe, 20, switch it real quick, and I'll volume it right back up to whatever volume I had it, 32, and let it roll. Sometimes if it's real, real windy, I'll just switch it right, to the sound that I want to switch it to without volume it down at all. To me, that's more or less, I don't know if it really affects anything, it's just more of a, mental thing, I guess, to say, okay, I'm going to switch this. And yeah, I don't know. That's one of those things that I probably put too much human thought into it. You know what I'm saying? More than what I should. I don't know if a coyote really cares how the volume affect, if you volume down or volume up or leave it the same when you switch sounds. But yeah, that's how I do it. I volume down a little bit, switch it, volume it right back up, and continue with the stand.
Is that what you do too?
Yeah, I'm the same way. I put probably too much thought into it. I volume it down, but the more I think about it, think about coyote vocalizations. When they howl, they don't just ease into it; they rip off. They're going. So volume, I think, is just let them have it. If they don't hear it, they're not coming. So they got to hear the call.
Cool, interesting.
Yeah, I've had way too many. The thing about coyote hunting is none of this we can ever prove. I mean, that's the crazy thing about coyote hunting. It's not like we can have some, video camera or something recording this coyote out there and watch exactly what he does, So we're taking, as a coyote hunter, somebody like myself that has, these theories and stuff, I'm taking just a very, very small sample size of a few things I've seen over the years and making these kind of broad assumptions, of what every coyote's going to do. And I know not every coyote's going to do the same, but it just falls back on the probability and percentages. A majority of the coyotes are probably going to do that. So, voluming up, voluming down. Back to your volume question, I'm sure some guys are probably listening to this saying, oh, God, no, you can't just crank the volume right off the bat. You're going to spook out coyotes. And I always think to myself, I try to relate back to why do people think that? How did this theory come about? And I think about it like this. At some point, and maybe even you listening or you guys have seen this, where you walked in, you sat down on a stand, and you fired the call up, and you looked out there at 200 or 300 yards, and there's a coyote running off. I don't know. Has that ever happened to you, Matt, or anybody?
Yep. Oh, yeah. Yep. So.
I think the average guy, if that happens to them, what's the first thing that goes through his mind?
Oh, the
spooked
call.
him.
Yeah, the call's too loud.
I played the call too loud. I spooked that coyote off. Well, I think about it a little different. I think more than likely that coyote saw you the whole time walking into that stand, watched you put the call out, and he was okay sitting there, but then all as soon as you fired up this noise now, that was enough to spook that coyote off there. Yeah. So I've seen that a few times, but what I've seen way more times than that is a coyote on a dead run with his nose in the speaker within about 30 seconds of the stand or less at full volume. So obviously if that coyote's to the call within 30 seconds, he wasn't very far, right? 100, 200 yards tops. And I played at max volume, and that didn't spook that coyote off. He came on a dead run and stuck his nose in the speaker, at 32 volume. So that's why I kind of feel like, the volume thing's kind of a little overrated. Don't be afraid to throw some volume out there.
Yeah. Well, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
If anybody else doesn't have anything, I got one more thing.
Yeah,
And it's just curiosity. Is that your lucky hat? Or in recent times, it looks like you've been wearing that hat or one very similar throughout. So is that the go-to hat?
This is my hat. Like I said, probably my second biggest passion other than coyote hunting is baseball. Coaching baseball, especially. My middle son is a big baseball player, and I've been coaching his travel baseball team here in Scotts Bluff since they were 8U. They're going to be 14U this summer. So our team is called the Wesco Bomb Squad. So our logo, the W for Wesco, is the same as the Washington Nationals. So this is just my hat that I wear all summer coaching baseball, and it's camoed. So I thought, hell, I'll just keep wearing it in the throughout the coyote season.
Now it's YouTube famous.
Yeah.
If it's broke, don't fix it.
There you go.
That's awesome.
And I'm with the younger generation, got the flat bill, so I'm in with them.
But you got to appeal to that audience too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, this has been awesome for me. I hope the listener got a lot of things out of this too, but me just going through my process, and it's like, I could talk for hours here. So, and the next thing I think, part 2 or an additional episode we need to get Geoff on is raccoons, calling raccoons.
Oh yeah.
Because that, I enjoy doing
sure.
that too, and have a lot of fun. So, and my process to doing that is, well, here's a tree, I'm going to throw out the call. Let's wait. So it'd be cool to kind of get to dive into that at some point too.
Yeah.
So
Maybe we should do a special fur
Yeah, I'd be game for
harvest.
that.
Yeah, that would be cool.
Yeah, that would be a good one.
I mean, the thing about raccoons, you touched briefly on predator management, as far as coyotes. I don't know if us as coyote hunters do a whole lot for coyote management. Killing coyotes right now, early in the fall, even in the middle of winter, doesn't do a lot for fawn recruitment and stuff, because that's not coming up for another 3 months. So if you're not out there actively killing coyotes in March or April, you're not doing much for predation stuff. But I think with the raccoon side, it seems like everybody I talk to that's a turkey hunter has seen a pretty big decline in turkey numbers in the last couple of years. And I think a lot of that has to do with the raccoon population. Just the fur market went under, nobody's trapping raccoons, and there's just millions of them now, and nobody's hunting them. And
there's
I think
no incentive to.
They're devastating your turkey numbers and things like that.
Yep, we definitely need to do that. That'd be fun.
Well, Geoff, from all of us here at Hornady, we appreciate you shooting our stuff. We're happy to have you on Team Hornady. Obviously, a national champion, a world champion in the coyote world. It's just great to have you as a resource and as somebody that's flying our flag. And we appreciate your time sitting down with us because, gosh, like Judd mentioned, we sure learned a lot.
Yeah.
Well, I've always appreciated Hornady being on my team and being on your team. Just being a fellow Nebraska-based company. It's something that I've always just loved to be a part of. So, yeah, I really appreciate you guys supporting what I do.
Awesome. Well, everybody out there, hopefully you enjoyed this podcast. I know there's something to be taken away from everybody, whether you're a novice coyote hunter like me or you're a seasoned veteran. There was a ton of information out here. Hopefully you can take something away, apply it in the field, and we'll catch you guys on the next one.